Channel 2. Okay, cool. This book is about the history of black rugby in Grahamstown, now known as Makhanda. Why is this such an important history? Simply from taking the name of the book, Line Breakers, the rugby playing sons of Makhanda, gives you a deep sense of history. There's always a challenge in writing a book of history when there are no records, there are no newspaper articles, the archives are empty. And this was the challenge of this book, how to tell a story of black rugby in Makhanda that stretches over 100 years. Siya Kolisi brought the World Cup to Makhanda in March 2020. And through that event sparked a look backwards because it showed that the Kolisis were playing this game through the long 20th century. The founder of Eastern Rugby Football Club in Makhanda was a Kolisi. A Kolisi kicked a penalty in the final in 1937 between Eastern Province and Transvaal, and a Kolisi was the captain of Cedru in the 1970s. And through that, we're able to link a narrative that stretches deep into the 19th century. It is a marvel that the first rugby club, black rugby club in Makhanda, was formed in 1887, Winter Rose. The second in 1894, Lily White. And this was at the height of colonialism. And it is even more of a marvel that these clubs existed through the long 20th century, through colonial dispossession, through the evil of apartheid, and into the present. These clubs still create a link in that history. And that is the power of this book in many ways, and the history that really grips, because it is told not only through words, but through the preservation of photographs. How did Ashwell and I decide to write this book, and why? One of the things that linked us together was this idea about how to write a history that has never been written. And it was an incredible challenge that from 2006, we had some great moments and some times when we thought we would never be able to tie this history together. And then all of a sudden, this idea of the photographs began to create a link, both between us and the history that we needed to write. This book, Line Breakers, A History of Black Rugby in Makhanda, forces upon the Sporting Archive another story. It's a story of sacrifice and redemption. I'm Ashwin Desai, co-author of Line Breakers with Ashwell Adrian, which is a history of black rugby in Makhanda.
Welcome everybody. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, my name is Carvin H. Golson. I'm going to be your host today. And I'm with the authors of this book, Line Breakers, Ashwin and Ashwell. We are going to get into some discussions. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, I want you to use the opportunity to put some questions in. I will get those questions sent to me and we will read them out. Please state who you are, where you're from, and what you'd like to know. For those of you who are in the studio, there's many people that are sitting here with us enjoying. Please note this is a live broadcast. Quiet. Don't walk past the camera, Fozia. Everyone, you can just keep quiet and just relax, and I'll come to you and we'll enjoy ourselves. Anyway, good evening. Ashwin, Ashwell, how are you guys doing?
Great.
Good.
Cool. Good. So for those of you who don't know, these are the authors. And the journey of writing this book goes way back. We're discussing about how, as far back as 2010, collecting information even further back. Ashwell?
Started off in 2006 when I did an exhibition on black rugby in Grahamstown and started collecting those photographs.
Sure. That process of collecting photographs, how did you go about it? Do you kind of know where to look, or was it this one leads you to that one?
Look, I wasn't alone. There were other people involved, especially Pumzila Adam, who was part of this project from the beginning. We applied to the National Heritage council to get funding to do the exhibition, and we had to go to individual families to collect photographs, scan it, and use it.
And these photographs are in albums, on top of wardrobes, hidden. People
Hanging
see
in
them
people's houses.
hanging
and
in the
so-
houses.
Yeah.
Because those would have been important pieces of memory, like this was my grandfather.
Yeah.
People brought them out.
Very important to,
Oh.
to most families.
So you took them away and said, bring my photos back. So Ashwin, once we get all these photos together, one of the challenges, I guess, is how do you take these photographs without any archives, without any history, and begin trying to see how this can become a book, a story that anyone can pick up. You don't have to have been there and say, oh wow, I can follow this story.
Yeah, I mean, just it was a daunting task, and you know, you just, even if you look at Ike's next door, there are bookshelves of history of Springbok rugby, written records, photographs, but even in contemporary histories, like Luke Alfred just wrote a book on the Lions touring South Africa, and it's as if black people never played rugby, except if they played under the tutelage of whites, as Proteas and Leopards and so on. But I expect it's just sometimes you get lucky in a sense. So the first person who was a kind of mad super spreader of rugby came from Makanda, Fana Manana. And what struck me in reading the biography of Thando Manana, the third black rugby player post 1990, he doesn't know this history. You know, he's like the first Manana that ever comes about. And yet there was a man who went from Grahamstown to East London, to Cape Town, to Johannesburg, and back to Grahamstown, all the time starting rugby clubs. And so that started to piece a narrative. The second part of the narrative was Kolisi coming, as I mentioned. And this idea like that these things run all the way back. And the way Kolisi is even presented in the biography that's written about him, as if he's a product of a white school, he's an immaculate conception, he's a new person, and he has no history. Is a history he himself doesn't know. And so something almost new arrives. And so that's how we tell the story. And it was humbling for me. I studied in Grahamstown. I first met Ashwell in 1980. And I thought I knew this history. But you just think that 1887, the first club gets formed, Winter Rose. Second club in the 1890s. Early, at the turn of the century, Wanderers. 1905, Eastern. And people think you can write this history by just collecting photographs. But deep inside of black life, where they all, with their own class distinctions. And it's like, so one of the reasons Eastern gets formed is that in Winter Rose, right? In Winter Rose, if you didn't go into high school, you couldn't play for the first team. And there was this idea that you know, the rest of the people were illiterate, and these were people of learning and so on. And so if you don't dig deep into these oral histories, you're not going to understand that history, and you're going to tell it in a kind of homogeneous way.
Ashwell, this world that Ashwell is describing, you actually played in it.
Yes.
And ministered in it. What was it? What was it like?
Look, I started off playing rugby at primary school and then high school. I was fortunate to be the border school's captain in 1980, 1982, winter codes under Sasa, then Sasa. But then my friend who was with me at school, Reggie Waldick, everybody knows him as Pete, recruited me to Lily White. So I went to go and play for Lily White after school. But the family club was Swallows. So I was supposed to play for Swallows, but then decided to play for Lily White because of a friend.
How was that taken? Was that like...
It was a huge thing, you know, it's like going across the line. But I already by then developed a consciousness of breaking down barriers. So it was important for me as a star at school to like show that, no, people can play anywhere. But Grahamstown is small, and there's a lot of integration amongst people, black and colored, Indian. So it wasn't funny, but like your family club would have a huge problem
Yeah.
with this thing of you having to go and play on the other side. I mean, for instance, Alistair Coetzee was also supposed to play for Swallows, but he went to go and play for Old Collegians, you know. So it's those kind of things, and there's a lot of tension. There was a lot of tension.
So,
that
so
it
how,
created.
how would people be introduced to rugby generally in Makanda? Was it through friends, watching,
No,
church?
it's a religion in Grahamstown. I mean, it's died down. I don't know why, but all the time. I mean, your first introduction to sport is rugby, netball, rugby. We didn't have the hockeys and soccer. Soccer came probably in the late 70s to Grahamstown. Rugby is like from your standard 2, 3, you would start playing rugby. But we would have street games, like the street against the other street, you know, in the street.
And so people would stay. They would stay in the area. They would grow up there, and rugby would be a part of that upbringing.
Of that culture. It's a culture.
I just want to read something from the book. John Alexandra, another founding member of St. Mark's, laments that this once bustling railway town now has an unemployment rate of over 80%. The railway, which had anything up to 1,000 people in the employ, today has a skeleton workforce of 5 or 6. Young people must leave the town to find work or get higher educational qualifications. Small towns in the Eastern Cape, for the rugby to thrive and to continue, needed people to stay. But as Mark is saying here, one of the things he laments is that so many people have had to leave these small towns. How's that been in continuing the legacy of rugby?
Look, I mean, you would notice that some of the top players from Grahamstown would go and find work, or they're being recruited by clubs in PE. Your Norman Korkos, George Lamani, and there's a host of others. These guys would find you work in PE, and you would play for Kwaro, Eastern Province, but you are from Grahamstown. And later on, some of them would return, but others would establish themselves in those bigger towns, especially PE, East London.
Ashwin, just one of the things that comes up quite early in the book, and we're speaking about these guys who played, but some of the images of women in photographs. Many of us have never seen that in sports photographs. Just a little bit about how important that was in incorporating in the book.
Well, I mean, it was like just when you think, everybody thinks they know history. And just to see in the 40s and 50s, well, firstly, many of the clubs had netball clubs and so on, allied. But just to know that women were so intricately involved in the running of these clubs is a humbling thing. When I got to Grahamstown in the early 80s, we thought we were like, you know, these were the first feminists, you know, in USAS who came to Grahamstown, you know, bringing some idea of liberation. But in fact, you know, deep in these histories, these things were already happening in different ways. And that is why, for me, history just doesn't unfold. You know, that one of the reasons for thinking about the title of the book, Makana and Stearman, is that, even this was before, after they named the airport after Stearman, is that it was amazing to me that I went through my whole education at Rhodes, and I didn't know that Makana and Stearman were in Robben Island together. I didn't know that this was the beginnings of an alliance between the Khoi and Xhosa in the 100 Years' War. I had no idea that they escaped on the same boats and that Makana would drown. I had no idea that, you know, Stearman would then, you know, be returned back to Robben Island, then be transported to Australia and die a miserable death. I had no idea of that. You know, we think Robben Island often starts with Sobukwe and Mandela. But just think about that long history. And then to just, one of the greatest players, you know, Makanda produced is a Stearman, who's in the book. And, you know, we interview him, we know him. But a deliberate act in the 70s, because you still had the African Rugby Union, the Coloured Rugby Union. It was a deliberate act to dump these rugby unions and to produce SEDRU, Southeastern Districts Rugby Union, and then SARU. a principled, hard-won non-racialism to the extent that Laidlaw, the All Black Scrum Half, writes that in 1974, that people refused to play an all-African team because that was seen as racist. That was the commitment to a kind of non-racialism. And so in between this, you see how these things just don't emerge out of nowhere, you know. And so for me, part of it was returning the town that gave me everything. It changed my life. You know, it was like I went there to study at Rhodes and I ended up playing for a soccer team in the township. And this idea of what blackness would mean in very real terms. And if you look at the photograph, and Ashwell will tell you this, of the club I played, you know, it was a political club. You know, 3/4 of the people will end up in jail. It was about reading, it was about an education for me. So to return to those playing fields and to be able to write a history in this fashion, after reading all those Marxist texts, and I don't know how many times I read Lenin's What Is to Be Done. I think I taught it to you a few times too. You know, to not understand the everyday agency of people, that I could spend 7 or 8 years earning many degrees, having no idea of what people are building the sacrifices. And maybe just to say, there are many people we can point to, but an example that people know is Lex Impati. Lex Impati grows up in Grahamstown. He works at the bar as a barman. He finally, because there's some law that tells you can't serve white women, he gets fired. He then joins a furniture firm. And, but he's a great rugby player. And he ends up as the deputy head of the Supreme Court of Appeals. You know, and so there are magic stories here of people from Grahamstown just doing very, very big things. The other thing I would just sort of say is that, you know, people just switch over as you keep asking actual questions because I couldn't work out like Speckman. Like, so there'll be a Speckman who happens to be African, but the present Speckman is colored. You know, how did this happen over time? And people were like choosing identities that suited them over a period of time. and then, you know, using those identities so in particular ways. So in a matter of 15 years, a person went from, in Xhosa speaking, to being a colored, and then, you know, and so on. And so this idea that apartheid or colonial just imposed identities upon you, that you stuck with it. No, people played and they juggled with them. The other thing is that most of us who were at Rhodes and in that period saw everything that was traditional as backwardness.
Sure.
And yet tradition is such an important part of what kept people together and their dignity. And that I only learned by going back and talking to people, like circumcision being like an important part of people's lives. And sometimes as people who write from the outside, we miss things. And you know, it's part made up and part apocryphal and part urban legend that Mark Giverser wrote an 800-page book, I think, on Thabo Mbeki. And he was going to East London to launch his book, and he thought he would be asked these incredible questions about Thabo Mbeki and, you know, his Marxism. And the first question that he was asked is, Thabo Mbeki circumcised?
I'm sure there's only a few people who know. I just
still use the Eastern Cape circumcision.
I just want to read from page 27 in the book, just to pick up where we are. As the politics of rugby grew and rebellion brewed in the townships, black students at Rhodes traveled the other way to the townships to play sport. Soon black spectators making their way to the campus dwindled to a trickle. While there was a state intimidation, there was also a heightening of political consciousness, as Eastern's Phumzile Adam recounts. During those years, we played our political role at the school to influence others. On the radio, we heard about the Leopards, the all-African side, and the Proteas, the all-colored side. Those teams were racially selected. Eventually, people were convinced of the wrongs of apartheid and racially segregated teams. I'm going to leave it there because I want to explore how important this was, Ashwell, in the consciousness of people. And sometimes we separate sports and politics in our minds, but in this period of time, these two things, this was actually important for even making people conscious.
Look, I mean, what you must really remember is that most political organizations were banned in that period. And people that were involved and came back from Robben Island, your Pilankais and all those people, Nkosinkulu's in Grahamstown, they came back with this idea of non-racialism. But you had your Alan Zinn at Rhodes University, Ashwin, Neville Singh, those who influenced what was happening in the townships. But Cedro was already there. And Cedro had a clear mission of transforming the setup in rugby. You had Koenig Mjesha, who was on the other side, who was president of the Black Rugby Union until unification. And your Mickey Healy's and those guys influenced the move away from racialized sport and established Cedro. But Cedro functioned on the Colored Rugby Union and the African Rugby Union. I don't know why it took so long, but it's only in 1976 that these two merge and become one Cedro. They were operating as two sub-unions of Cedro.
Phumzile Adam is online. I'm reading a quote from Phumzile Adam. So we're going to try to get Phumzile Adam on screen. Just to kind of elaborate, I'm just going to pick up some more of what Phumzile Adam was saying here. We used to say to people, here in South Africa, we need to have one team representing the country because we are one country. There is no white country, colored country, and black country. We are all one. So that is what we must support. And the fact that there are even white Springboks who are racially exclusive, we need not support those matches. Hear Phumzile Adam, it will be great just to hear from Phumzile just what it was like as a young person and how they saw their role at that particular time. I think, Ashwin, if you consider sports, and you've done quite a bit of work on sports transformation and looking at it, the importance of these sports voices actually speaking up, irrespective of how loud it is, even if it's just a small influence of a club, how important those are.
Well, it's, I always say we've all been marching about decolonizing the curriculum, Rhodes must fall, and so on. But there is an intellectual laziness, because how are we going to populate the new archives? We have to go and do the hard work. We have to tell the stories. We have to go and really dig up these historical works. Otherwise, we seem a people that just emerged from 1990. And so even in the present, there'll be, no disrespect, there'll be a biography of Graham Smith, but there'll never be a biography of Mackay and Tini. You know, so, and then when the biographies of the Beast and Sia are written, they're written in particular ways. You know, and so part of my project and Ashra's project is to say that, yes, we are adding to the archive and we're debunking the archive at the same time. And it's incredible, so much of this work has never been done. And so, you know, one of the big influences running through these pages is Biko, for example, because that's where Biko, just at the entrance of Grahamstown, makes his final trip. That's where he gets picked up. And that influence of black consciousness was there in the 70s, early 80s. It inspired people and was part of the process of building a unity of colored and African in that town. Yet it's been written out of history.
Actually, yourself, when I went through the book, the Adrians feature prominently. Are these your uncles? Are these, I'm on page 46, 47, there's Adrians everywhere.
Yeah, it's my great uncles who played for Swallows.
So you really offended them when you changed?
Yeah, because it's a family thing. I mean, Grahamstown rugby is based on the church, the family, and that's where you go. If you are Methodist, you go to Swallows. If you are Kong, you go to Rainbows. You know, so it is. That is what it was.
Was there really a religious affiliation with the
Yeah,
club?
I mean, Universals is a club of the Catholic Church.
Wow.
You know, Easterns comes from the Anglican. You can see their colors. You can ask Phumzile as well. Winterose is I think Wanderers is Methodist, you know. So these clubs are linked to churches.
That's fascinating. Okay, I'm now on page 70, and there's a story here about Alliston Bully Cole. I don't know if you want to tell us about Alliston before. We can put up a picture of him here.
Look, Bully was a very young kid, and he went to a funeral at the J.D. Tlepu Stadium because it was at the height of the unrest in 1985, I think.
85.
85.
Yes, man, it's fair.
Yeah. And I mean, we didn't even know that he was there. He was there with a different group. But all of us were involved in the Grahamstown youth movement. But I was involved in the rugby, and I went there with rugby guys. And these chaps from Grahamstown youth movement went to the funeral. And it's only when we were back in our area that we heard he was shot and he's gone to hospital, and heard that he died, you know. Very young, I think. Bully wasn't even 16 years old. But he was a soccer player. Played soccer for Mary Waters.
Recounting these stories, I'm just going to read a piece from page 70 about it. This is when Bully was murdered. People were scattering in all directions, and me, Bully, and another student comrade that was with us that day, we ran in our direction. This is Tyron Austin speaking. Ran in our direction, and the other students, they ran in their direction. But it was just unfortunate, or fortunate for me, that me and Bully and Aldred Pink Eye September was running in the same direction. It was while we were running that I saw Bully put his hand to the back of his head, and I realized that he was running slower, and I actually helped him run. When we entered the yard on the opposite side of the street, I realized that he couldn't even climb through the fence line that was that low. He actually fell, and I picked him up, and we ran into the toilet. It was in the toilet that I realized we had to get him into the house so that he can lie down, because what happened, he was sitting in the toilet seat, and he told me that he was getting drowsy. But then I touched his hand, I felt it was getting cold, and I realized that we will have to get to the hospital. And as you're saying, he eventually died. And recounting these stories, the context that they add to this book, because while we're talking about sports and we're talking about politics, there's also real lives that were integrated into these stories, that were lost, celebrated. Ash?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first time Ashwell and I met was at a funeral. Boy November. It was 1980. And I pitched up at the funeral, and just the power. And it was the first time that Mary Waters, which was a scholar school, marched across the hill. And students, we were the first black students at Rhodes that were allowed to study there. We had come, it was 5 or 6 of us. And it was the beginning of something, out of a horrible thing, something very big that happened in Grahamstown. A movement was built. There were many funerals to attend. But I think Bully was very close to us. And we were part of a group that met every week. And suddenly just the sense of being shot in the back of the head. I think both of us can remember the funeral like yesterday.
Yeah.
So in our own histories, in many ways, without wanting it to impose itself on the narrative, is reflected in these pages. And there are clubs here where 70% of the team would be in detention during the states of emergencies.
Sure.
And people spend a long time in detention.
Yeah.
So we didn't want to, it's not a story only about rugby. It's really a story about a town that built a culture of resistance.
We got Phumzile Adams unmuted. We'll get Phumzile because I think it's important. Phumzile's voice in the book speaks to us quite a bit about resistance. So if we can get Phumzile just to join us on screen. One of the characters I found interesting was Rommel, and Rommel. It comes up again and again, and for someone like myself, you always, when you're reading a book, even a book that's historical, you're looking for characters to latch onto, and Rommel was one of those characters. Ashwell?
Look, I mean, he's like the father of Swallows now. Swallows always have this, or all the clubs have this figurehead.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah.
have this figurehead, and Rommel is now the figurehead. Is Ralph George Douglas. His father was George Douglas. And it's been going like that for years. And you would find guys like Wumbai Daniels. I don't even know what is the man's real name, but we all know him
He's
as
Wumbai.
Wumbai Daniels. You know, he was the figurehead of Rainbows all these years. You have Desmond Abrams Twans, who was Universals, you know. And
Well,
the
Was Rommel a good player? Was he
yeah, he was a good
great
player. He played at
I want to
scrum
read a quote from page 90 from the book. Modest about his own talent, Rommel reflects, I was not a good player. I was just a fit player. I had to practice a lot. I jogged in the morning before I went to work. At night after work, I would jog again. And then I would go to the field and practice with the team. The guys knew we must keep the pace up. If you're not fit, you won't last. I was pretty fast. So I don't know, he's pretty fast, but not a good player.
No, he was a good player.
Yeah, he was
But
great.
he's still as modest as he narrates the story there.
Ah, fantastic. I want to just get to some questions. We do have some questions for those of you who are watching on Zoom. First question I'm just going to pose to you guys. What role did Lovedale play in the history of black sports? And that's from Betty Government. And I don't know if you want to take that, Ash.
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, the mission schools played, you know, an incredible part as part of the civilizing mission. It was, you know, it was part of trying to say that if you play these games of colonial sport and you play them well and you got an education, you would bump yourself up. Of course, it reached the limits of, you know, the racist colonial mentality. But I think the whether one likes it or not, the real influences of rugby in Makanda were the private schools, the white private schools. They are a powerful influence because black people worked at these schools. They watched young white boys play. And even in the photographs, they often replicated the way the photographs were taken.
Yeah.
So the ball in the front and so on. And it was only in the 70s did people start saying that you boycott these games, that you build your own culture of rugby. And so, but there was a lot of borrowing of styles, and there was a lot of sense that your name was given from either White or Rhodes University team. So I think when I got to Rhodes, there would be hundreds of black people come from the township to watch in a segregated section Rhodes University play what was then the University of Port Elizabeth. So it had those influences. So Rovers, one of the clubs, was formed by Rhodes workers. But the mission schools play this. You know, the big mission school in Grahamstown was finally closed down and sent out of Grahamstown.
Page 101, there's an excellent picture. The Lily White members, George Lameni, Tonono, Sikulolomo, with the trophies they won. And if you ever look there, for those of you who are in the room, there's a great picture. Just tell us a bit about that picture there, Ashwell, because we see lots of trophies, the culture of collecting trophies.
Look, in the 1980s, Lillywhite was one of the strongest teams. I played for them in that era. And we won most of the trophies. And the most important one was the Makakana Trophy. It came from I think in the early 1900s. That trophy came. It was first on the Eastern Province, and then one club from Grahamstown won it. There was court cases about it. Eventually, it was given back to Cedro to run it. Lillywhite was also the first club that would participate in tournaments, club tournaments, that different clubs would host as fundraisers. You would have your Swallows tournament, your Universals tournament, and then you had tournaments in King Williamstown, East London, by clubs itself, one-day event. And you would play 4 or 5 matches for that day, you know. And
4 or 5 matches for the day.
yeah, and Lillywhite won some of those tournaments, and that's why you see so many trophies and shields.
And
One of the great men of rugby is in that photograph, who's still living, George Lamani.
Yeah.
And when you read his words, he was also somebody who thinks through these issues very deeply. And he was one, you know, when we were doing the book, Chris Mann, who's the son of Tufty Mann, the Springbok spin bowler, actually played for Lillywhite. And he kept saying, talk to George Lamani. And it's one of those real grassroots intellectuals. But how he was thinking about race, about rugby, about building a culture. And I think he's seen the book. And you know, the way, like, even if it's critical, like you always worry because you're writing about real people who are still living. You don't know how they're going to receive this history. And he loved it, I think, Ashwin.
Yes, I mean, George and Romo had the same comment. We couldn't imagine that we will read our own history while we're still alive, you know.
Sure.
And it's for me, it says a lot.
Yeah.
It means that people are interested in recording history around their social being. And it is for that reason that I think this is a catalyst for many others to come. That's quite an important thing because people are not, I mean, there is no archive, like Ashwin said. I mean, we look for things in the Crockett Mail, the local newspaper. You would find like a one paragraph, you know, about reporting on rugby of the black side. But you would find half a page of Rhodes and St Andrews and Kingswood, Graham College, where Chicky Watson used to play, you know.
He was an important part, Watson, an important part of also the integration.
Yeah,
Ashwin.
yeah. I mean, and a person like Chris Mann, whose poems you used, who went to play, there were people who crossed those lines. And you know, it took a lot of courage. And so it was a powerful thing. And we tried to capture some of that in the book.
I mean, there was guys, Bartlett and Weekly, Alistair Weekly was murdered here on the Wild Coast. They played for Cedro, you know, and they were banned by, I think it was Korenov in the 70s, and they couldn't attend functions. They would be slipped into the township, like on the Friday during the day, because tomorrow the game is on, and they would sleep in the township and play the game and then slip out again, you know.
So taking all these stories and weaving it together, what's the process? Do you lay the photographs out, make the weave, okay, this one links to that one, or do you kind of find the narrative?
Look, I mean, there was a lot of interviews that were done. You sat with some of the players that are still around, and I mean, a lot of them have died.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at skipper Kibro Magobiane, who was the first captain of Cedro. I mean, I just interviewed him, and a few months later, he's no more.
Wow.
You know, last year I interviewed Toro Macholweni. A week later, he's dead. You know, and that is what has happened. I mean, Robbie Cole, Elliston's father. He was also a stalwart of Swallows. A week later, he's dead.
Wow, that's a lot
You
of
know.
people that just...
And we lose the history because their stories have gone. You know, so this is like the primary history. And if you think about it, that the great rugby traditions of Kwaru and Eastern Province, nobody's told those stories. I mean, that was the real bastion of heightened black rugby. People played at the highest levels. And the Majola brothers in Kwaru, Kaya is dead, but Gerald Majola. If you look at Eastern Province, like two of the greatest wingers, the two Desmonds, Desmond Boyce and Desmond Kramer, number 8 Charles Glenville, they go in, some of them are dead, they die. And people are not doing these histories. So we're marching around saying Panzi colonial history. So do we want to Paul Potterism? So we have no history. Because on the other hand, people are not coming forward and wanting to do the hard yards to write these histories. And yet people are so generous with how they give off their stories. You know, yes, you're going to get some flack like with Wentworth, as you know, people look at the back and say, my name is not there, my father's name, my mother's name is not there. But I think if you think about our own histories, just the Jaguars and so on, pioneering rugby clubs, even this town, the people are dying with their stories not being told.
I mean,
it's a crime.
there's a guy from Grahamstown who played for Natal at one stage, Ashley Bowles. I don't know, I was hoping that he would be around here because he can tell you a lot about rugby in Grahamstown.
What we want to do at this moment, for those of you who are watching on Zoom, we want to cross to the people that are in the room. Those of you who have questions, please feel free to just stand up, say your name, and give your question. I'll then relay the question for those who can't hear you. And so you can stand up and just say your name.
I just wanted to know from the authors.
What's her name? What's her name?
Oh, sorry, excuse me, from East Coast Radio. I just want to understand from the authors, is it the most appropriate time to talk about these sort of stories? Obviously, to have the Irish Lions happening. Is it I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is this the most appropriate time to tell these sort of stories with the Springboks what's happening right now? Or is this sort of like a time when you can sort of take something from what's happening with the cricket? Do you feel this is the most appropriate time to talk about what's happening right now in cricket and relate to rugby? Or is it something that you guys have planned for long time?
Elaborate.
Yeah.
You're asking, is this the most appropriate time?
Is it the most appropriate time to talk about it right now?
Why do you mean right now?
As the Boston Irish Lions is happening, because we've had stories before that, and as we're talking right now with cricket, there's a racial thing happening in the SJN area. So is this the most appropriate time to talk about it while it's still going to happen over the weekend, or is it something that they already planned earlier?
Okay, so this is the most appropriate time for us to have this conversation, to be having this launch, is what Spool from East Coast Radio is asking. I don't know what you who wants to go for
Can
it?
I respond?
Yeah?
I think one shouldn't wait for appropriate times. History is history, and when it gets published or gets told, then it should happen. We shouldn't wait, and whatever the Springboks and British Lions are doing now, and Cricket South Africa is doing now, is important as well. But our histories must be told.
Ashwin, is there
Yeah, look, and one thing to say back to reporters and journalists, they just want the immediacy of events. They want the instant story. They themselves don't want to actually know these histories, and I can't imagine how we can understand a game that we're writing about without knowing its history. And so for me, for example, in cricket, there was a bowler from Cape Town, Dika Bed, and there was a bowler from Durban, Patrimon, and Patrimon got into the Springbok team. But you can't actually compare cricketers because there were black cricketers and white cricketers. But they both played in the Enfield Cricket League at the same time in 1969. And you can tell from the statistics who was doing better than the other player. So these histories are important, to evoke the sense about where do these histories come from. And that's, for example, Seer is not a recent invention. And those kind of dignities, you're right, there's no timing to it. We started in 2006.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe it's the most appropriate time, right? And many of us feel it because if you look at the pages of this book, that George Lamanni brilliantly says they were playing sevens kind of rugby because of their size. They were small because of nutrition or lack of nutrition and food and so on. In fact, there's a story of one of the Nkunti brothers where they were living off the crumbs of their mother working in the kitchen in St. Andrews. So a white center, would be bigger than a prop in black rugby. And it does influence us. And that even in post-1990, Brayton Pauls were told, you're too small to play as a wing. So it does, of course, give us some sense of ourselves when in the first test against the Lions, the front row were 3 black players, because it was capsizing the stereotype of the idea that to be black you must be on the wing because you can run fast. Of course it is. But we only get that dignity by knowing what happened before. And the sense that this is revolutionary, that the front row. Because just think from the unification of rugby. How many black players played in the front row? You know, so the revolution happens. You can't know it's a revolution if you didn't know what the past is. And I'm sorry, too many journalists and so on just get away with the instant rather than the histories. And histories can hurt you, of course. And they can challenge you. But they can give you such beauty because you can relate the present to the past and know that for every black rugby player, for every white rugby player, there was a George Lamani. Not only playing the game at its highest level, but thinking about the game in a sense of prefiguring at the height of apartheid. A George Lamani, Phumzile and were thinking, this is what the kind of team we would like in post-apartheid South Africa. You know, I mean, it's just quite incredible to be playing on broken fields and to think there was a vision of something else. Did any of the Afrikaners have a vision of something else? They had a, you know, so this is a big thing about the imagination. How you prefigure society by building it now. And George Lamani was recruiting white players from Rhodes University and so on. Because he was building it now. He wasn't going to wait for apartheid to fall. But in doing that, he was making apartheid fall.
Sure. Anyone? Yes? Name and question.
Shall I stand?
Yeah, you can stand.
Sedendo from imbibe.com. The question is simple. Are we there yet? Do we have that situation of saying, we were told about, this is the team that we want to have. The team that won the World Cup in 2019 is the team that we want in terms of transformation and everything. Is that the team that we want? That we want to have that team. We want to have the team that is being led by a captain that is intelligent, talented, and everything, regardless of color. Do we have that team? Without saying the winners should. I've seen on social media saying somebody shouldn't be there and stuff. We were talking about a little man. We have our little men now in terms of Chelsea. So that guy is good. We cannot.
Yeah.
But the question is, are we there now in terms of transformation? Because we have a huge team here. Let's play against the British and Irish Lions. Some of them are saying we kind of not there. Those ones are jealous. To win the World Cup. But then, I mean, in terms of everything, are we there?
Yeah, okay. So, are we there? We've...
My response would be that transformation isn't about changing the colors or replacing black players, white players, and black players. It should happen, the state should take responsibility by improving facilities at primary school level, develop athletes at that level to come through. You know, you would find that we have like hundreds of students or children that are able and that are talented, but they get lost when they go to these bigger provinces and being paid. They are not being educated in terms of what to do with their monies that they earn. Some end up being alcoholics or drug addicts, you know. And I'm saying that once you cannot only develop a athlete, but doesn't teach him how to manage things.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, these white kids have got all those kind of support systems where they are being groomed to invest and develop businesses. Whereas our children are not fortunate enough to have those things, and that's where the state has to play a role.
Okay, just a question from Zoom, Dr. Nongogo. My main question is to the publishers and the authors of this important book. Given the close relationship between the Borderani and Ibai rugby, is there a plan to continue this work and write other regional histories which might culminate to a provincial rugby history?
Well, Pilani did his doctorate on the history of black rugby, a fantastic doctorate on the history of black rugby in the East London, King Williamstown area. And I think it does point to an place, is that who gets to publish? When do publishers take a chance? Why is Pilani's PhD not in book form? And so on. And I think Shooter and Shooter have been fantastic. I've no doubt that the CEO, Primit Chetty, played a part in it. The fact that Mr. Sandile Zungu is the chairperson of Shooter and Shooter, but owns AmaZulu and is interested in the history of black sport, played a part. Heather Hanaway. So, in the sense that he asked the vital question that I said, people don't publish, but what are the opportunities to publish? Because when you fill in the form, it asks, what's the market? Who are you going to sell it to? Can it do this? Can it do that? And in a way, you literally and figuratively blackballed. And so, yes, I think this book for people like Pilani and so on does open a sense that publishers will take it on, that it is a topic that people are interested in. It's not just for the archives. And therefore work like he has done then, would see the light. So yes, I would like to write with him. I already told him that. So there might be possibility, but the publishing game is a hard game. Yeah. And also universities are like geared to write, in journals that nobody would ever read, but that's what they count as history and as making it. So there's many battles to fight, but I think the fact that this book got published is in itself a victory.
Yeah. Just a follow-up question from the doctor. Have you benefited from the previous works of Jeff Pyers, Odendaal, Manny Bully, and others when working on this? Was there any reference from their any work they done?
Yeah, I think it is. The art of of academic life and intellectual life is to say why your thing is new and rubbish everybody else's work. But I think there's a famous saying that the people he's mentioned, Andre Odendaal, Peter Haynes, and Andre Odendaal write a book called Pitch Battles. Bully's work on mainly in the Western Cape and so on. You stand on the shoulders of giants to try and see further. And I think ours is a very focused case study of a particular place that changed the nature of rugby and changed history in that town, because these were not only rugby players and administrators, they were political activists. And they broke through the kind of racial town that Chris Mann writes about in that poem. Yeah. But they had a vision of something called non-racialism. And you'll hear it through that book in people's voices. So I think in that sense, it's not a meta-narrative. It goes deep into personal histories and personal stories. And I think many of us, find that important. And just to come back to your question, I was just going to say that every generation sets itself new tasks. Yeah. I'm at the stage, I'm 62 years old, right? When I see Siya Kolisi lift the Webb Ellis Cup, I'm excited. I go off my head. I can give you the criticisms. I can tell you about, all the kinds of things that maybe lay beneath that, But there's something that moves us. There's something when, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a former British Lions player. Before the Rugby World Cup final, he writes in The Guardian that the best thing that South African can do is not to pay Siya Kolisi, in a sense that he was a passenger. And And you have a sense that the first time, no matter what we say, that he was under the ball and he's going to drop it. He's going to drop all of us. And the fact that he then lifts the cup is for us. How can you not be moved by that? Not every time we have to super analyze things. How many times he carried the ball? You know, how many times he went into the ruck? You know, all that. No, sometimes you just get moved by a picture. And you get moved by that person comes to embody a history that you are living through. Because you are writing this book, you know this history. You know what it means to Phumzile Adam. That he feels his life's work, the hard yards he put in, the fact that he built Easterns and helped build Cedru, that he gave all his energy and time and generosity of spirit to us to make this book gets a vindication. You know, sometimes we must just take our victories.
I want to bring in Marcus. Marcus is online, but before we do that, let's take one question from Marcus. Yes, Marvin and then,
Hi, good evening, guys. Another night from the Sunday.
Uh,
So my question, though, my point of interest is the administrators from back in the day, especially communities like Grahamstown, because often administrators in such communities are unsung heroes because of the work that they do in the background. And it's often their resourcefulness that keeps the wheels turning for teams. So through your research and interviews and interactions, what did you pick up in terms of their cleverness to keep, basically to have a kit for your team, for travel and those kind of things? You know, the ingenuity that came through for them to make the game be better.
So Marvin from Sunday Tribune asking about administration. I think Ashwell, you as an administrator yourself.
Look, I mean, at some stage, it hit your pocket, because in that era, there was no sponsorship for black rugby or soccer. I mean, some people would take their salaries to what's the name, to fund the club, so that the club can keep going. They would buy jerseys, they would buy socks. I mean, I remember one of Swallows' guys buying me a pair of boots to play, you know, because my boots got stolen.
I just want to bring in Marcus. Marcus Solomon. On camera, sorry. I just want to bring in Marcus Solomon. This is his name. Friends. Oh, Marcus, how's it, Marcus? Put your camera on in the bottom there. Just a camera. Woo! Are you with us? Can you hear us, Marcus?
Yes. Can you see me?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
You got to put that video on.
You put the video
It's
on.
I unmuted it. I mean,
There you
There
go.
we go. There we go.
Could I first just say, Marcus, we don't mind, that one of the inspirations for our book and the man who held our hand through it, even before is Marcus Solomon. I know he doesn't like this, but you know, Marcus Solomon spent 10 years on Robben Island from 1964 to 74 in the general section of the cells. It was very inspirational to many of us in the 80s in terms of our own politics. And even in this book, his family history is here. And so he's read the book, and we very honored to have him. He might criticize our book in his usual fashion, but we'll take our chances.
Marcus, what's your criticisms of the book?
I just have praise for the book. I just want to start by saying thank you very much for having me here. I want to congratulate Ashwell and Ashwin. And I think it's a fantastic bit of people's history. Now, I was born in Grahamstown, number 30 Albany Road. I know Ashwell's parents and grandparents, so I know him before he was born. In fact, Ashwin was also had some association with a nephew of mine, but I won't go there. It's an absolute gem. You know, I cried in fact, I've got a picture of,
Wow.
on page 42, my great-grandfather, Henry William McMaster. Ashwin gave it to me. So rugby is not only about playing. Rugby was my life, or part of the influences of my life. And when I go through this book, it was a walk through my childhood, my adulthood, and the more I think, it was a socializing influence. I can speak the whole night about it, but I just want to mention, it is of great personal interest to me. And that's why it's the first thing I said, these photos must be shown, Port Alfred, Ellisdale, Alexandria, Bushmansrivier, Ikawi, and all those people. No, I also spent time in Port Alfred, and I knew the Matthews family. Garnet Matthews, Eastern Province flyer, grew up, his family was in Port Alfred. But the most important thing I want to say, and I think Ashwin mentioned it, our people have had agency long before 1994, before 1955. People had history, people had agency. Somebody asked about administration. Our people did national tournaments with their own resources. They organized these things. So I think I'll come back at some time to actual the histories of the other sports, cricket. But all these things are related. Choral music. I knew of a jazz group, Chris Chris. And some of the people who played the most beautiful music were delivery boys for the white people. Those histories must be written because those were our influences. And of course, like Ashwin was saying, it was with the kerk, congregational men, was rainbows, swallows, the Methodists, and so on and so on. I remember Anpolina, Charles Wessel's grandmother. Saturday afternoon, she used to walk past our house with a basket of food. Sy gaan rugby vandag kyk, is haar dag. So I think Ashwin, thank you very much for a wonderful piece of history there. When I tell people about these things, there was nothing for me to say, it was there, man. Don't you believe me? Now I can say, Ashwin wrote a book, you know.
Thanks.
The stuff is there, man. You know, the pictures are there.
Thanks,
And
Marcus.
I can tell you, these people had, when you had to play rugby, you just go and play rugby on a Saturday. You spoke rugby from Monday to Friday. Thursday you had to practice. Woensdag aand was team talk. Was het dinsdag aand of woensdag aand? Zondag moet je kerk toe gaan. Je moet zelf gedraaid, je kan niet zaterdag gaan spelen, gaan die mensen. Nee, hij was whatever. So I think it's important. Somebody asked about other histories, publishing. Our universities are more interested in the histories of individuals. And I want to say publicly, I've said it many times. Ashwin, you've shown the way. And I think we just want to see how proud we are of you. I knew Owen McKaiser when he used to play cricket. I know Ashwin's mother and his aunties and his cousins.
Yeah.
And some of the people here, by the way, who are here today. Teddy Calvert was my principal, not the guy who's up there now.
Yeah.
He's probably Uncle Nick's grandson. And Ivy DeVos, she's an amazing doctor. Is that so, Ashwin?
Yes, yes.
Thanks,
Here we go. So for me, it was a journey through my life. The more I think about it, the more I say rugby, cricket, kerk, our people, and those were wonderful people.
Thanks, Marcus.
So I just said, thank you very much for the
Thank you.
opportunity, Ashwin. And of course, the kettle there. Van waar is hy? Alles maar die beste.
Hey, Marcus.
Thanks, Marcus. Thank you. It's so good. How does it make you feel to hear that somebody that you've written about, and like you were saying earlier, these people are alive, so to hear them speak about it in this way, like our parents all told us stories about how they did this and did that, and they can never prove it. And all of a sudden, this man
Marcus
can now prove it.
mentioned how like Owen McKaiser, who's my grandfather. He was a sports administrator. He was part of the Colored Management Committee for years in Grahamstown. He mentions Teddy Calvert, Mick Calvert. These guys have had influence. I mean, for instance, the White Council wouldn't allow Cedro to play at Lebanon Valley. And Owen McKaiser took the decision and said, no, the fields are open. We've been living together in Fingo Village. Let them play. And Cedro used to play the matches at Lebanon Valley,
Sure.
which was basically a colored field.
Dawn, you had a question?
Yes, I did. Hi, my name is Dawn Jan. Whoever I haven't traumatized on radio. Firstly, gentlemen, I just want to say very big thank you for this book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I have been looking for storytelling. I do believe storytelling is very important. It's the only way we can learn our history that was suppressed. We didn't know about it. So thank you for the storytelling. And then my question to you is, when you look at where we were and where we are now, and you look at our current journey with our Springboks, let's take Mapimpi, for example, and we look at how late he was recognized, how brilliant he is, and coached by a big union, and actually looked after properly. So how do we improve the youngsters in the township that are brilliant but don't have the resources, don't have the way to get onto the field to be recognized? I did an activation with VUCA before COVID, and it was a group of boys that played brilliant rugby and they played barefoot. Guys, we have to try and change this, because if we look at where we were, how far we've come, we still have a long way to go. So my challenge and my question to you is, how do we help these youngsters move forward? How do we support them? And how do we better put things in place to look after them?
Question, how do we help our grassroots level sports, young boys who are spotted early, talented? Is there any lessons in history of things that happened that made the sport move forward that we could borrow from for the future?
Look, I mean, there is some progress. But as I said earlier, that I think the state has to play its role by providing more resources. I mean, you can't cut the Eastern Cape sports budget at school level, was cut from 1 million to 300,000 rand because there's no sport because of COVID. Instead of using that money to develop sporting facilities, to buy equipment for these kids. I mean, we don't want to see a kid going from Mary Waters to Kingswood College and only get recognized when he's at Kingswood College in Grahamstown, whilst the foundation was laid at Mary Waters. We would want Mary Waters' name to be there. You know.
We're about to wrap up. Just before we wrap up, just another question from Dr. Nongogo. I'm very interested that you use a lot of people's voices in an era where some question the role and importance of oral history. What do you think is the future of this form of data collection? And just a follow-up to that is, who in fact owns the history, and specifically, what is your view on the Springbok emblem? So just two questions there. Firstly, looking at who owns the history.
For me, people owns the history.
Yeah.
And it's a very important thing. I mean, yeah, it comes nicely through. People are telling you. It's not an academic writing a book and saying, this is what I surmise it to be.
Yeah.
It's people telling their own stories.
Ashwin, yourself, this is, Wentworth was a similar sort of experience, going through and actually sitting in people's houses and this is now data collection in this way, the future of it?
Yeah, firstly, I mean, I would love to write the history of the Dunn family in KwaZulu-Natal. I think that that could be some history, you know. And it's crazy that it hasn't actually. The Finns, the Dunns, it really will, I think, begin to puncture the idea of who is 100% Zulu.
Mm.
And could there be that notion when Shaka appointed these people as chiefs? But that's a side issue. You know, oral history, I think what Dr. Nongogo is pointing to is that people lie or people make up things, and how do you tell? Or also people remember things in particular ways because of the circumstance. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So most people who are in Ramaphosa's cabinet forgot that they supported President Zuma in the no confidence debate. You know what I mean? We forget quickly. Afiki Lumbulula, he's forgetting every day. So the idea of oral history is fraught with hand grenades.
Yeah.
But I think even when you lie, it's saying something about what you think. You know, so by having a number of voices, you do get somewhere. And that's in the book, by having those number of voices, we actually show when SACOS and the NSC were trying to get together, what it meant, how people viewed it. We give 2 different voices to that, or 3 different voices, how people have this idea. We're not passing judgment on it. And so oral histories remain a very a powerful thing, because people say, oh, you know, voices lie, documents lie. You know, they found a document where apparently Peter Retief had a document that the Zulu king gave him the land. You know what I'm saying? Documents lie. You know, so all kinds of things can lie. It's how you read them, you read against the grain, you measure different sources, and you begin to tell a story. You know, but there's truth telling. So when we talk about there was a Kolisi in 1905, well, he's there in Eastern. When we say there was a Kolisi in 1937 who kicked a penalty, he was there in the record books. When we say that Vuyani Kolisi won a number 6 jersey, one of the greatest loose forwards, played for Eastern and was captain of Cedru, he was there. So it's the people who think they're writing the truth, who have never mentioned this history, like Luke Alfred, who are telling lies.
Well, that's the end of our conversations. We do have time for one more question, but for those of you who are watching and asking where can you buy the book, important. We are at Ike's Bookshop in Florida Road in Durban. For those of you who want copies, there are copies here. There are other bookstores participating where you can purchase this, or you can get it from Takealot, takealot.com. Just go in there and they'll have it delivered to you, or you can pick it up. Before we go, Marlon, I know you've been asking to ask a question.
Yes.
You've been like,
Is this appropriate?
it's appropriate time for this question.
Good evening, I'm Marvin Shetty. Actually, I'm still a working journalist, although I was shown the door at Front Roads in 1930s. I received a letter from an apartheid minister saying I'm not white enough. It was Grahamstown Group Areas Act. Actually, that was just before your time, when I came out of nearby high school. So that's like my own footnote. But I went back as a visiting lecturer, and I need to still go back. So thanks for the memory of the Grahamstown, and not only the Duns, the Finns, Morris Finn, who hacked down the whites only sign on the beachfront. We've got Fozia Piri here, former deputy city manager. That history, and also the Flames, the greatest band in living history, the Flames. We always discuss it at the Durban International Film Festival. Who's going to do that book and who's going to make the film? So it goes on and on. I still think, Ashwin, you know, great respect to you. You should have been the lead writer at Curry's Founders.
Thank you, Marlon.
The book is there, but just one question, 1990.
You got a question too?
You're censoring me. 1990s, Ashwin, you mentioned a significant point post-1990s. Now, I remember people like South African Rugby Union, you just mentioned, well, out of the whole South African Council on Sport, I think some were the hardliners, they were the hawkish. On the cricket side, as I say now, no normal sport, you have normal society. Then we have Sam Ramsamy, 88, sitting there. The significant point of the 1990s you touched on was it completely eclipsed by the NSC that you mentioned, and Sandrock, Dennis Brutus, SACOS, and that whole history has gone away. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marlon. Thank you. So that's the end of our broadcast. For those of you who are watching at home, thank you so much for tuning in. To all the legends, members, people who are part of the book, whose stories are being told, thank you for lending us your stories for
Thank you.
Yes. And to all those that have attended, thank you so much for being here, for being part of it. Ashwin, you want to do some thank yous to thank some people who contributed to
Look,
the
I need to thank the people of Grahamstown that allowed me, because I'm not the writer. They are the writers of this book. It is them, it is their story, it is our story, it is not his story. So for me, it is something that I hope will encourage other people to write as well their own stories.
Yeah, first we would like, both of us I think would like to thank Julian Cobbin, who was a great historian.
Oh yes.
But he just gave us his photographs. I think Ashwell went around there and some of those photographs are his. The other great photographer whose photographs are in there is Cedric Nunn, who has a brilliant book of photographs called Unsettled on the history of the Eastern Cape. It is just a brilliant book. And when I met him, he was just so generous of giving us. So we thank him and thank the publishers and the team, Vera and Theo and the rest of the people who put this together, and you who came. And we hope you stay. And there's wine and pizza, you know. We're talking about religion. It's not for nothing that good mind turned water into wine. So partake and you know, stay for a while. And you know, every time when Carmen kept saying take a lot, I was thinking like, take a lot doesn't mean you running down the hill into mackerel. Take a lot means but take a lot of wine and take a lot of pizza. and thank you and thank you really, very kind of you to all of you to come. And thanks to Cedric, who's just been so stoic in just supporting sort of books and people, and to Joanne at Ike's, who just makes the place available for nothing, and we're able to have this kind of function. Thank you.
For those of you watching, Ike's Bookshop, where you can find it. Thank you, Axel.
Thank you.
And that's it from us here.